Good morning, dear students. Today we are going to discuss about the Sale of Goods Act 1930. It is most beneficial to the students of CBCS and MG University syllabus. Thank you. Can we move through Sale of Goods Act 1930? Just go through the introduction. Sale of goods is the most common form of contract. It can be maintained as a separate chapter in the Indian Contract Act 1872. In 1930, this branch of law was codified as a separate act, namely the Sale of Goods Act. In this chapter, we are going to explain about what is the presence of Sale of Goods Act, why it can be maintained as a separate act in Indian Contract Act. Because in our everyday life, in case of let me take an example. In case of students, you can purchase a book or even a pen or even a coffee, a cup of tea. In everywhere in our life, in every day and in everywhere, we can see sale of goods. So, sale of goods is the most common form of contract. So, it should be maintained as a separate chapter in the Indian Contract Act. And later, this law became codified and an act can be enacted in 1930, that's called the Sale of Goods Act. The main point is that sale of goods is the most common form of contract in our everyday life. So it can be maintained as a separate chapter. Okay. Then we can move on to the next session, that is contract of sale. What do you mean by the contract of sale? In the first module, we can also discuss about what is contract. Contract of sale means whereby the seller transfers or agrees to transfer the property in the goods to the buyer for a price. Simply, we can say that seller transfers or agrees to transfer the ownership of the property or the goods, ownership of goods to the buyer for a price. And we can closely analyze this into two parts. One is contract of sale, maybe one portion is sale and the second portion is agreement to sell. Okay, we can divide it as two. One is sale and the second one is there is an agreement to sell. Let us see what is sale and agreement to sell. There is some sort of difference between sale and an agreement to sell. What is sale? Simply means the property of the goods is immediately transferred from the seller to the buyer. In this case, you can go for purchasing a book or a pen. The transaction is immediately completed. You pay the money to the shopkeeper, and he immediately transfers the right of the property to you. The sale part is completed. The property of the goods is immediately transferred from the seller to the buyer. Then what is the difference between sale and agreement to sell? But in agreement to sell, property of goods is transferred in future only. Listen that only the property of goods is transferred in future time, or it may subject to certain conditions. For the transfer of property in goods is to take place at future time or subject to certain conditions. That is called agreement to sell. In case of sale, immediate transfer of property is happened. But in agreement to sell, the property is transferred in future time or it may subject to certain conditions. These are the main difference between sale and agreement to sell. Next one, what are the essential elements of contract of sale? Of course, one thing I again remember you that on sale of goods act is also applicable the all general principles. What are the general principles you followed in contract act? All those principles are applicable to sale of goods act. Okay, listen to that. All the principles which we followed in contract act is also applicable in sale of goods act. Okay. Next session is essential elements of contract of sale. There are 5 essential elements of contract of sale. Unless otherwise, there is no contract of sale. The first one is there may be two parties and goods, price, transfer of general property and contract. First one, the essential element is two parties. In case of an agreement, even if it is a sale of goods act or a contract act, whatever it is, there must be two parties to constitute a contract of sale. What are the two parties? There may be a buyer and also a seller. Who is buyer and who is seller? That you all familiar that buyer means a person who buys or agrees to buy goods. Who buys the goods? He is known as buyer. Seller means a person who sell or agrees to sell the goods to others. He is known as seller. In case of contract act, like that, sale of goods act also, there may be two parties in a contract, there may be buyer and seller. And the second essential element of contract or sale is goods. Goods means the subject matter of the contract. What is the subject matter? What we transfer, the good, the property, that is the subject matter of a contract. Contract or sale must always be goods. In here, only movable goods can be the subject matter. Contract or sale, we consider only movable property or movable goods. Listen. First point explains two parties means buyer and seller. Buyer agrees to buy or buy the property. Seller agrees to sell or sell the property. Second case is goods. The subject matter of the contract. The contract is this contract or sale. Only movable goods can be the subject matter of the contract. Listen carefully. And the third one is price. What is price? The consideration for transfer of ownership. That's called price. The consideration for transfer of ownership should be price. Only goods are sold or bought for money. The sale of goods are applies. Here this case, in contract of sale, there is barter system is not applicable. What is barter system? Barter system means goods can be exchanged on goods. That is not applicable. Only money based goods transfer is considered here. Price is an essential element. Next one is transfer of general property. What do you mean by the term general property? It means it stands for ownership. The sale of goods applies only if ownership is transferred. Unless otherwise there is no need of sale of goods act. Only it is applicable if ownership is transferred. In case, what happens when possession alone is transferred? It is not contract of sale, it is like a bailment. The possession is transferred is like a bailment. But in case of contract of sale, we can really transfer the ownership of the property. When possession alone is transferred, there is no sale. That is called transfer of general property. Ownership should be transferred. Last one is contract. Sale of goods implies a valid contract between two persons. The contract is valid only if it satisfies all the essential elements of contract. You all familiar with the term contract? What are the essential elements of contract? All those you are familiar. All those elements like free consent, who is of the age of majority, the parties are competent, sound, all those general principles are applicable in case of contract of sale. So these are the essential elements of contract of sale. Two parties means buyer and seller. Goods means the subject matter of the contract. Third one, price. It is very essential the consideration unless otherwise it is not a contract of sale. And general property means the ownership must be transferred. Not only the possession, not bother about the possession, ownership is transferred. Contract means all the essential elements. What are the essential elements applicable to Contract Act is also applicable to Sale of Goods Act. These are the essential elements of contract of sale. Okay, move on. Next session. Sale and agreement to sale. The two terms sale, contract of sale, we can already classify it as sale and agreement to sell. It can be differentiated on different bases. We can move on to each basis. What are the different bases it can be differentiated? First one is nature of contract. What is the nature of contract? In case of an agreement to sell, first we talk about agreement to sell. Agreement to sell is an executory contract, but sale is an executed contract. One is executory and another one is executed. Why it is executory? Because in agreement to sell, the process will happen in future date. It's always in executory mode. May or may not happen in future. It may happen only if it happen in future date. But it is executed means it is already happened. The sale is already happened. Agreement to sell is executory because it will happen in future date, and sale is executed because it is already happened. And the next term is transfer of property. What is regarding the difference of transfer of property in sale and agreement to sell? In case of an agreement to sell, the transfer of property in goods is to take place at a future time. That is the difference. Agreement to sell property is transferred only in a future date, or it may be subject to certain conditions. Future date transfer of property in future date means it may be say sale happen in 2 weeks after, 3 weeks after, 1 month after, or later date. That is called transfer of property in a future time in case of agreement to sell. But in case of sale, the property of goods passes from the seller to the buyer immediately. We can transfer it immediately from the seller to the buyer. That is called transfer of property. Agreement to sell, it can be transferred in future time, but in case of sale, the property or the ownership is transferred immediately. Next, we will discuss about what is the base of risk, how it can be differentiated risk in case of sale and agreement of sale. Risk of loss in agreement to sell. If the goods are destroyed, suppose we think that if the goods are destroyed, what happens? The loss, who suffered the loss? If the goods are destroyed, who suffered the loss? The answer is simple. In case of agreement to sell, the loss falls on the seller. The seller suffers the loss because the sale process is not at all completed. So the seller manage or the loss falls on the seller. But in case of sale, if the goods are destroyed or the goods are lost in sale, the loss falls on the buyer. These are the main different risk of loss. In agreement to sale, the risk is suffered by the seller, but in case of sale, the risk is suffered by the buyer regarding the destroyment of goods. Next one is consequences of breach by the seller. In case of agreement to sell, who breached the contract? Consequences of breach by the seller. The seller breached the contract. What happens? We can see. If the seller commits a breach, the buyer can sue the seller only for damages. The buyer can act against the seller for whatever damages happens, only for that damages. If the contract is a sale proper, what happens? The buyer can compel the seller. In case of sale proper, the buyer can compel the seller for delivery of goods or sue for damages. Buyer have the right to compel the seller. Listen that in case of agreement to sell, the seller commits a breach, buyer can sue the seller for damages. But in case of sale proper, the buyer can compel the seller for delivery of goods or sue for damages. Two situations, may or may not. He can once he can sue for damages, or otherwise he can compel the seller for delivery of goods. That is the regarding the breach by the seller. Next one is insolvency of the buyer. In agreement to sell, if the buyer becomes insolvent, what happens? In case of agreement to sell, the buyer becomes insolvent before the payment of price. The seller can retain the goods. If the buyer is insolvent, the seller can retain the goods with himself. That is the point. If the buyer is insolvent at the time of payment or before the payment, the seller can retain the goods with himself. But in case of sale, if the buyer becomes insolvent, what happens? The seller is bound to deliver the goods. See the difference insolvency in case of buyer. First one, if the buyer becomes insolvent before the payment of the price, the seller can retain the goods with himself. In case of sale, the buyer becomes insolvent the seller is bound to deliver the goods to the official assignee. He is ready to deliver the goods to the official assignee or the receiver. In first case, he can retain the goods with himself. The second case, he must deliver the goods to the assigned person or receiver. Next one is insolvency of seller. As a similar case, what happens in first point, insolvency of the seller. In an agreement to sell, if the buyer has already paid the price and the seller becomes insolvent. In this case, buyer making the payment and the seller is insolvent. The buyer can claim only a rateable dividend. What is the right of buyer? He can claim only a rateable dividend and not for the goods. In sale, the seller becomes insolvent, but the buyer is entitled to recover the goods. In first case, he can claim only for a rateable dividend. In an agreement to sell, the buyer can claim only a rateable dividend and not for the goods. But in case of sale, the seller becomes insolvent. What happens? The buyer is entitled to recover the goods from the official receiver. He is entitled to recover the goods. First case, demand for a rateable dividend, and the second case, he can buy back the goods. He is entitled to recover the goods from the assignee. Next one is general and particular property. Here is two terms we can see. An agreement to sell creates only a gest in persona, that means to claim rights mutually between the seller and buyer. There is a mutual rights between the buyer and seller, that is called a gest in persona. Wherein in the case of sale proper, that means in case of sale, it creates a gest in rem. The right is one which can be claimed against the world at large. In the first case, they can mutually to claim rights mutually between the seller and buyer. They can make claim only between the buyer and seller. In the first case, just in persona means they two, because that means the buyer and seller can mutually claim against each other. But in the second right, just in rem means the right is one which can be claimed against the world at large. We can claim to the total world at large because the right of ownership is vested in the buyer. The second case, ownership is vested in buyer, so he can claim against the world at large. Next one, regarding a resale or resell, that's called right to resell. In an agreement to sell, there is resale of goods. Why? Because in agreement to sell, the sale proceeds will happen only in future. So if it is any differentiation happen, if it is any failure happens, the goods can be resold. If there is resale of goods, the buyer who takes the goods for consideration and in good faith without notice of the prior agreement would get good title. In case of sale, the seller cannot resell the goods because the ownership of the goods is with the buyer. See the difference. In the first case, agreement to sell, seller has the right to resell the goods. But in case of sale, the ownership vested in the hands of whom? Buyer. So, it is not possible to resell the goods. These are the main differences between sale and agreement to sell. In case of nature of contract, executory and executed. In case of transfer of property, that means transfer of property in goods or transfer of property goods passes from the seller to the buyer. Risk of loss in case force of loss, consequences of breach by the seller, consequences of breach by the buyer, insolvency of the buyer, insolvency of the seller, general and particular property, and right to sell. Okay, then we can start